Caught on camera. Video shows a Chinese fighter jet passing right in front of a U.S. plane's nose. The U.S. calling it an unnecessarily aggressive maneuver by the Chinese jet during an intercept over the South China Sea. China fighting back, saying the U.S. intruded on their space. This comes as China's defense minister refuses to speak with his U.S. counterpart. What do you think about the high-altitude acrobatics? Let us know below and subscribe if you haven't already.
This program is brought to you by Preserve Gold, the #1 precious metals IRA provider. Call 855-962-3322.
Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Close encounters thousands of feet in the sky. U.S. Indo-Pacific Command says a Chinese fighter jet performed an unnecessarily aggressive move while intercepting a U.S. spy plane Friday. Here's a look at the J-16 aircraft from the perspective on board the U.S. RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft. The two planes are in international airspace over the South China Sea. Video shows the Chinese jet cutting in front of the nose of the American aircraft, forcing it to fly through turbulence. China's military says the U.S. reconnaissance plane deliberately intruded into its training area, adding the move seriously undermined regional peace and stability. China claims jurisdiction over much of the sea, but international law considers it open airspace. The U.S. military command saying in a statement, the United States will continue to fly, sail, and operate safely and responsibly wherever international law allows. This comes as China's Defense Minister Li Shanfu continues to refuse to speak with Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, despite repeated U.S. requests in recent months. The U.S. sanctioning individuals in China and Mexico. That's for alleged involvement in the illegal fentanyl trade. The U.S. singling out 17 people and entities in the move. They're being accused of enabling counterfeit fentanyl-laced pill production. The businesses and people are allegedly linked to the sale of pill press machines. The machines can impress counterfeit trade markers onto illicitly produced pills, often laced with fentanyl and destined for the United States. How do these sanctions help end this epidemic?
Well, first of all, I got to say it's a good step forward by this administration to do these and impose these sanctions, something that I've been calling for a long time. And it's a good step forward. It doesn't, in my opinion, go far enough. These are sanctions against certain individuals and certain businesses, but they're not sanctions against the governments themselves. That's where I think with the administration would be a much bigger impact if you actually place sanctions on the government of Mexico and, of course, the government of China, because we know that they're both in connection responsible for that fentanyl coming into our country.
The Treasury Department also tasked another team with going after the money laundering that's involved. It's an industry worth billions, often benefiting cartels. There's also the massive human cost. The rate of drug overdose deaths involving fentanyl more than tripled in the United States from 2016 through 2021, with over 100,000 Americans dying from overdoses last year, according to the CDC, most stemming from fentanyl. As Beijing's tensions with the U.S. and European Union bubble up, Communist leader Xi Jinping is issuing a stern warning to China's top national security officials. Prepare for the worst. How does the comment relate to the fallout of the U.S.-China rivalry? And is China also facing other crises? Let's dive in.
Xi's remarks come as he chaired the National Security Commission meeting on Tuesday. In it, he put the issue of national security high on the agenda, urging officials to be ready for, quote, worst-case scenarios and prepare to withstand even dangerous storms. According to a report by state news agency Xinhua, Xi said the country is facing dramatically increased security challenges. He warns officials must stay keenly aware of the complicated circumstances. This isn't the first time Xi's highlighted China's security challenges. But the latest, and probably his most stern directive, comes as Beijing grapples with a host of challenges, ranging from a struggling economy to what it sees as an increasingly hostile international environment. In March, she criticized Washington for being the culprit of the West's so-called suppression of China. The U.S.-China rivalry expands on numerous fronts, from the escalating tech war to geopolitical disputes over Taiwan and the South China Sea. In turn, both sides have stepped up national security scrutiny. The U.S. imposed sanctions on a slew of Chinese companies, and China restricted its purchases of U.S. chip maker Micron. Beijing is also facing challenge in Europe. Earlier this month, the European Union's foreign policy chief said China-EU relations would be critically affected if Beijing did not press Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. On the domestic front, Beijing is pouring a lot of resources into suppressing any perceived political threats, with spending on police for in-person protests and censorship for criticism online. China affairs analyst Tang Jingyuan says she is warning of the worst-case scenarios and dangerous storms ahead might include a war over Taiwan. But he notes that this could also indicate a severe international crisis within the Chinese Communist Party that may threaten its rule.
A former New York Police Department sergeant facing trial Wednesday with two other men. Prosecutors accused them of harassing Chinese fugitives living in the U.S. NTD's Jason Perry brings us the latest.
Opening arguments are being heard at the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse. 3 men are accused of acting as illegal agents for China. They're accused of pressuring a New Jersey resident to return to China to face embezzlement and bribery charges. All 3 men pleaded not guilty. The names of the defendants are Zhang So-ying, Ju Young, and Michael McMahon, a former New York City policeman who was working as a private investigator. Prosecutors say Ju and others in 2016 hired McMahon to watch and investigate Xu Jin, a former Chinese Communist Party official who has lived in the United States since 2010. Prosecutors said Zhang in 2018 left a handwritten note on Xu's door, which read in Chinese, "If you are willing to go back to the mainland and spend 10 years in prison, your wife and children will be all right." In opening statements before a federal jury, McMahon's lawyer said his client was told he was working for a Chinese construction company trying to recover assets, and he alerted local law enforcement of his activities. The lawyer said if he's secretly acting on behalf of the Chinese government, is he going to call the cops and tell them he had no idea, none, that he was working for China? But a prosecutor said McMahon met a Chinese official during the course of his work, saying McMahon knew this was not the true reason. He looked the other way. Lawyers for Ju and Zhang, both Chinese citizens and New York City residents, also said their clients didn't know they were working for China. Prosecutors explained that this was part of the Chinese Communist Party's, or CCP's, worldwide operation to bring alleged fugitives back to China, and that campaign is known as Operation Fox Hunt. Last month, federal prosecutors filed another case at the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse. 2 New York City men are accused of operating an underground Chinese police station in Manhattan's Chinatown. Jason Perry, NTD News, New York.
The U.S. and Europe are converging on their China views. That's according to U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. While speaking at the EU-U.S. Trade and Technology Council in Sweden, Blinken said that the West isn't seeking to isolate China, but rather to sustain relations without supporting developments that could pose a threat to their national security. Blinken also said the U.S. and EU are working closely to diversify supply chains, adding that neither the U.S. nor Europe support decoupling from China, but they are in favor of de-risking. The idea of de-risking was first brought up by EU President von der Leyen back in March. It sought to urge European nations to reduce economic dependency on China, especially on critical goods like rare earth minerals. As of now, both the U.S. and Europe rely heavily on China for manufacturing those materials. The nation currently accounts for 85% of rare earth processing in the world. Now we turn to the Middle East. Saudi Arabia appears to be strengthening its ties with China. It's reportedly in talks with the New Development Bank, a Shanghai-based bank also known as the Brics Bank, to join as its 9th member. The Brics Bank was set up in 2015 by the world's biggest developing economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Altogether, those nations account for 25% of global GDP. The addition of Saudi Arabia, the world's second-largest oil producer, would strengthen the bank's funding options. That's as its founding shareholder, Russia, struggles under the impact of sanctions amid its war in Ukraine. On a visit to China this week, Russia's prime minister said one of the bank's main goals is to help reduce the impact of Western sanctions. 65 million infections per week. That's what Chinese authorities are bracing for in June, based on top experts' predictions. What's the latest on China's virus situation, and what's the capital, Beijing, doing to prepare? We have the details.
Beijing's Municipal Health Commission released its 20th weekly outbreak report of the year last Wednesday. COVID-19 infections topped the list for the fourth consecutive week, with infection cases quadrupling from week 17 of this year to week 20. A citizen in Beijing told NTD that authorities are calling for emergency preparations.
Our sub-district office handed out a notice this morning advising us to prepare pandemic prevention supplies in advance. They said it was a guideline by the Municipal Health Commission.
A doctor in Beijing said 70% of recent fever clinic visitors were COVID-19 patients. Of these, 80% were first-time infections, with reinfection rates also on the rise. Elsewhere in China, doctors echoed those findings.
It's true that in the last 2 weeks we have seen far more COVID-19 patients than before. Most of them were infected for the first time. Our hospitals are seeing a recent rise in reinfections. There was even a bed shortage a few days ago.
Compared to the earlier outbreak this year, some patients have noticed different symptoms from the current wave, reportedly caused by the XBB Omicron subvariants.
This time, the symptoms include severe fever as well as sore throat. I didn't have such a bad fever when I was infected the first time.
Others said they have no choice but to go to work despite the infections. That's to make ends meet amid soaring unemployment and an economic downturn. This problem further contributing to virus spread.
Australia is looking to revitalize its critical minerals industry, and now Washington is pitching in to help. The two nations have agreed on a new deal called the Climate, Critical Minerals and Clean Energy Compact. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese informed the country's parliament Monday. He explained the deal would aid the processing of critical minerals and maintain a sustainable supply of them. Plus, it would also expand and diversify the nation's clean energy production, including hydrogen, battery technologies, and other clean energy products. The pact works by allowing Australian minerals and energy suppliers to be treated as U.S. domestic ones under Washington's Defense Production Act. That investment will then help the Australian companies develop. Over 50% of the global lithium supply comes from Australia. The material is critical for making electric car batteries as demand for them rises. That's as much of the world works to go green and find lithium alternatives to dominant producer China. Officials from the U.S. and Australia say a new task force will develop a plan to improve collaboration and development by the end of the year, while a government report shows Australia could achieve over 20% of global lithium refining by the year 2027. Hong Kong's judicial independence is making headlines once again. A high court rejecting a request by now jailed media mogul Jimmy Lai to end his national security trial. His case has become a symbol of Beijing's crackdown on Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. Let's dive in.
Jimmy Lai, the founder of the now-defunct Apple Daily publication, was one of Hong Kong's most prominent critics of the Chinese communist regime. He would face a maximum life in prison if convicted under the Beijing-imposed national security law. In a departure from Hong Kong's common law tradition, the security law allows for a non-jury trial if the case involves what Beijing deems state secrets. In Lai's case, instead of a jury, his trial will be heard by 3 judges, handpicked by city leaders. Lai's lawyers had earlier filed a motion to halt the trial, citing a lack of transparency. But the court ruled on Monday that accusation of potential bias had no merit and greenlit the proceedings. They're set to begin in September. Lai was jailed last December for over 5 years in a separate fraud case. The national security law came into force in Hong Kong 3 years ago, after months of protests calling for political freedom. Beijing has been using the legislation to silence dissidents, criminalizing supposed acts of secession, subversion, terrorism, and foreign collusion. Western governments, including Washington, have expressed concern about Lai's plight. They condemned the security law for eroding the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms.
That's all for today's China in Focus on YouTube. We're now sharing a shortened version of our program here after being demonetized for 2 years. Here's what to look out for in our second half. What's the biggest concern surrounding China's cyber attacks on Guam? And what's China doing to compete with Elon Musk's Starlink? We spoke to Rick Fisher, Senior Fellow at the International Assessment and Strategy Center, for his take. The full episode is available on our partner platform, Apok TV. To sign up, click the link down below. Thanks for watching China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. See you tomorrow.